Well, hey, friends, welcome to Awakening's Ask a Scholar podcast. This is where you, the everyday Christian, can get your questions about the Bible answered by a biblical scholar. I'm Carla.
And I'm Mike, and we're both glad that you decided to join our discussion. So let's dive in.
Well, welcome to Awakening's Ask a Scholar podcast. We are really excited to jump into your questions on the book of Numbers, and we have Dr. Dru Johnson with us. Dr. Johnson, welcome. Thank you for being a part of this episode.
Thank you. It's a
Um,
pleasure.
Dr. Johnson, you are a visiting professor at Hope College in Michigan, and then you're also the director of the Center for Hebraic Thought. So tell us just a little bit about who you are, your story, and then we're going to jump right into the questions.
Well, my story's too long because I wasn't expecting to be I wasn't expecting to be an academic, and certainly not in biblical studies. Um, but I have ended up in this weird position where I'm interested in the Hebrew Bible and its influence on the New Testament authors as well. And the Center for Hebraic Thought, that's a lot of the work we do, is what is the thinking of the biblical authors and how does that influence including the New Testament authors, and how they influenced by the Torah. We also have the Biblical Mind website where we have scholars kind of write accessible articles on all kinds of topics about how the biblical authors think about different things. So that's kind of as the kids like to say, that's my passion project. And I work a lot on weird things like how the Bible, if it were compared to any other literature, would just be called a philosophical, philosophical worldview or whatever. And how the biblical authors think and reason about the nature of reality, and why we the church should take that way more seriously than we do. We say we do, but we really
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah. And what's that website? I think our listeners would appreciate checking that out.
Yeah, the super nerdy one is Hebraicthought.org, but
Okay.
most people will not enjoy that because it's all scholars talking to other scholars.
Okay.
But the one that's meant for regular people, where we have videos and podcasts and
Yeah.
articles, is biblicalmind.org.
Okay.
So lots of helpful resources. We've tasked, my best friends and colleagues who write really good stuff and do a lot of research on these topics, and they think very deeply. And then we just ask them to write, hey, give us that in 1,000 or 2,000 words that anybody
Yeah.
could read. So.
That's awesome. Okay, cool. Well, if you're ready, we're going to jump right in because we've got a list of good questions that I know people are itching to get answers to as they've been
I
reading
am
through the book of
so
Numbers.
excited to talk about numbers that I might overwhelm at first. I'm trying to regulate myself because even as I've been preparing for this, I've been like, oh my goodness, there's so much. So, okay, I'm glad we
Yeah.
have some pointed questions to work through.
Yes, yes. And hopefully you can expound and you can go on as many rabbit trails as you want. I know our listeners always love that. So let's jump into question number one. And this is kind of I think, an easy one to start with. The question is the purpose of the first and second censuses in Numbers strictly historical, or are there other values that the writer is intending to portray that we as readers should be picking up on?
Yes, it's a simple question, but it gets to the heart of the entire piece of literature that we call Numbers, which is it kind of begins and kind of ends. They have a census later in the book. And it's easy to remember it's called Numbers because you have it's bookended by these two censuses, these two head counts that get taken.
Yeah.
And the head counts, but I don't think I realized this for a long time, maybe until I was in seminary, that Numbers is it's the book with the 40 years in it. Exodus happens all very quickly. Leviticus is a bunch of instruction that really has no timeline to it. Numbers is where the 40 years of wandering happens, and then Deuteronomy is the getting ready to go into the land.
Right.
So the sense between those two censuses is what creates the 40 years of wandering. So you have to ask, the question is, why do you have to take two head counts? Why don't you just do one head count and call it a day? Because that had to be a lot of work. And the first head count is to basically collect the number of all what we call today military age males, the ones who can go up and fight. Because they are getting ready to go straight up into the land of Canaan and take it as God has promised them. And then we have stumble, fail, rebellion, rejection, which we can talk about later. And then God says eventually, okay, that's it. We're done. We're going to take another census. And the purpose for that census is stated at the very end of it. The very last sentence of that census is, and these are all the people who are now going to die in the wilderness. And then later we find out, sadly, that even Moses himself is going to die
Yeah.
alongside those people in the wilderness. And it's only Joshua and Caleb who were excited to
Mm.
go see how God was going to do this thing that seemed impossible by human standards. They're the only ones who escape the second census, as it were. So the
Mm.
first one is kind of like so many biblical books, they start out with the excitement of what's going to happen and how are they going to do this thing that God has called them to, and then they end up with a big womp womp womp,
Yeah.
of they failed to do it, and therefore the second census tells us who is not going to go up in the land, and their children are going to go up instead of them.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts on that one?
I like the idea. Like I like the connection between the first and the end. Um, one commentary that I did read, it was interesting. The writer proposed that this might have been an elite emulation. So sort of a little bit of a taunt or a mockery of this other major powers' use of military power and might, and
Mm.
that like you'll have this large number of people listed out ultimately in numbers, and it's sort of emulating like maybe the Egyptians army or the Hittites army, and ultimately
Mhm.
it's just sort of to say this is the in the end the amount of people that will be coming into the promised land. And it's almost like a parallel. It's not to be a direct comparison, but that was at least one scholar. But I do like the way that you're pointing out, Drew, that essentially you're seeing the 40 years, and in the end you get to the end, to the last census of like, okay, so who survived, who made
Yeah.
it through
Right.
the 40 years?
And the numbers are tricky there because many people have pointed out when you add all this up, it comes up to a couple million people, maybe 2.2 million
Hmm.
are some estimates. And that seems out of whack with the region. Like the region can't physically support that many
Yeah.
people. It's clear from the text that Israel is going up as a minority. They're fighting a larger force. They're weaker, by all physical accounts, and yet that would have them almost outnumbering the people of the land, and
Right.
or outnumbering the Egyptian army at that time. Like, why couldn't they just like manhandle the Egyptian army if they had that many people? So there are some. I mean, this is still a point of debate or contention or mystery for scholars. They're trying to work out maybe these words for thousands that we use. Aleph might be better rendered as groups, or in some sense a legion. That it's counting families or clans or units of people
Hmm.
rather than 1,000 per. And those seem attractive. It doesn't solve every problem with the big numbers and numbers, but it solves almost all of them by just saying they're probably 600 groups of people of varying sizes, and that would actually kind of match the landscape, match the numbers you see in Egypt and Canaan at the time,
Yeah.
and put us back on the map. So even when you said the historical meaning of the censuses, historical might mean different things depending on what you think is going on with the head counting. But that they head
Hmm.
counted to come in and take the land, and that it was going to be a show of force with a kind of David-sized group of people,
Yeah.
seems to be the rhetoric of at least Numbers and Deuteronomy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I like that definition, and I like thinking of it in that way. It does seem to kind of help set the tone for, what's happening in that book, what's about to happen in the book, and then what's about to happen in Deuteronomy whenever you
Mm.
you finish up that book. So, okay, let's jump to number 2 because this is an interesting one. This one says, why is there a harsh penalty and potential curse for women regarding adulterous acts, but not necessarily for men as described in chapter 5? We also see a harsher penalty for Miriam versus Aaron when they both opposed Moses in chapter 12. Were women during this time held to stricter laws?
Yes. Okay. So I love this question. I love it
Hmm.
because it's paying attention to the detail of what's
Yeah.
actually going on there. I also love it. I'm writing a book on biblical law right now, like just kind of an intro into biblical law, how to read it without making massive mistakes and projecting too much modern ideas of law onto it. And I've talked about this passage a bit because it's both a ritual. Yeah, I've worked on ritual in the past,
Hmm.
so it's both part of that kind of Levitical ritual extended in the Book of Numbers, but it's also law. It's a commandment. So a couple of things. We don't know from the biblical law. It's not clear whether all. Well, it is clear. Uh, Many rules seem to be assumed that they go bi-directionally. but they don't state the bi-direction. They only state one direction, but they seem to assume that it works the other way.
Gotcha.
So, for instance, in the laws of Leviticus 18 about family members you can't have sex with, it doesn't say you cannot have sex with grandma, right? Which you would think that would be a family member that they would have put out. But if you read through the logic, it does go, grandma can't have sex with her grandchildren. But that's presuming they're both Hebrews, that they follow
Right.
the law, etc. So there is this kind of massive question about biblical law. How many of these laws work both ways or in different directions outward?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. I like to think that law is wisdom teaching. So it's not telling you a rule to follow. It's actually giving you paradigms and concepts and guidance for how to think about yourself and how to act in the world. Two, biblical law has this feature that most ancient Near Eastern law does not have. You get little bits and bobs of it some places in Eshnuna laws and Hammurabi's laws, but it's not resident. It's not a resident feature like it is in biblical law, and that is that the laws are always looking out for vulnerable people.
Mm-hmm.
Even eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The concrete instance of that immediately after eye for an eye, tooth for tooth is if anyone has a slave, male or female, and strikes them in the eye, then they must
Yeah.
release the slave. They strike them in the tooth, right? So even eye for an eye, tooth for tooth is looking out for vulnerable people. And so what I say when you read laws like this, one of your first questions should be, who is this trying to restrain who has power? And who is it trying to protect who is vulnerable? And what's interesting about this law is there is a law if a man suspects a woman of adultery, then they do a trial by water where she has to either drown herself in the river
Right.
or stick her hand in a pot of boiling water or oil or something like that, something that is inherently harmful to the person. So commentators will note this doesn't have any of those features. What she does is only harmful if God judges her and she's guilty, right?
Right.
So it actually this law, this ritual, whatever you want to call it, this court trial,
Mm-hmm.
does no harm to her whatsoever, only if she's guilty. Now, we read elsewhere in the law that a person guilty of adultery is actually, it's a capital crime, right? So in some ways you have this other problem, like, well, wait, why if she's guilty, her womb or her stomach and her leg rot away or swell,
Right.
depending on how you translate that, and why isn't she executed? Like that would be following the law. But again, this is part of a wisdom tradition where God is helping them to understand who they are. And so there's adaptation, there's exceptions all over the place. It's not like legislation we pass today where you either break or keep the law. That's not how they tend to think about the law. Okay, so this woman, I do want to point out an obvious feature that if you're reading ancient Near Eastern law, what is so different about this version, which is it begins and ends, again, it's bookended with, if a man has a woman who's committed adultery, although he didn't witness it and he suspects it,
Yep.
or if she didn't actually commit, but he has a spirit of jealousy or a spirit of
Yes.
suspicion, to translate that word. And so it begins with two cases that you don't know which is the case. And you find out because God is your witness. And it ends with, this is the law. It repeats the same thing at the beginning. This is the law when a man suspects a woman because she has been unfaithful, or he suspects her and she's been innocent. So the law presumes from the outset that there are women who are going to be mistreated by their husbands because they suspect them of adultery. And I like to speculate that if you are a woman in this condition, there's some social vulnerability here. You can be mistreated, and you can look your husband in the eye and be like, get some bread. We're going to the temple tonight. Like, you don't need to suspect. You don't need to mistreat me.
Right.
Let's make a journey. Let's go 2 days or 4
Yeah.
days. Let's go to the temple. I'll stand before God. I'll drink it.
Yeah.
I'll recite the words. I'll say, amen, amen, true dat, whatever, whatever this thing that you do, I'll do it because God is my witness. So it actually restores power to the woman. Now, most people see this as degrading, humiliating of the woman. What they're usually thinking of is the Mishnah, the early Jewish rabbis, or within the lifetime of Jesus and then a few hundred years afterwards, are writing about this practice, and they're adding new rules to the practice. So the woman has to be stripped naked, or her breasts have to be exposed, and she has to have a rope tied to her. That she has to be gazed at by all the men, like everybody has to stare at her. And
Yeah.
so that version of the ritual by some of the rabbis, I shouldn't say all of them, is clearly a shame-inducing ritual, and
Yeah.
it's intended to be. but that's not what Numbers says. So, but sometimes people will confuse what they've heard of what the rabbis taught with the actual ritual itself.
Mm-hmm.
So
Interesting.
then I answered the question. Oh, the harsher penalty. Now the question is, can a woman bring her man?
Right. Does
Can
it
she
go
bring her
both
husband?
ways? Yeah. Does he get to drink and be judged before the Lord?
Yeah. So a lot of people think that's impossible. It, by the way it's written, it seems to be impossible, but maybe there's a way. But the sentiment is there. Miriam is an interesting example as well, because she does get treated seemingly more harshly,
Yeah.
or she does. I mean, she suffers
Right.
physically from something that her and Aaron were complicit in. But I think the reason most people would say, and I ask in class every semester, hey,
Mm-hmm.
why her and not him?
Right.
Um, and I think the reason that makes the most sense is Aaron is the high priest on behalf of Israel. There's
Mm-hmm.
like a metaphysical problem if he gets leprosy. Like they just started up the whole process by
Hmm.
which the priests are made clean. They're made clean and they're made holy for service in the tabernacle, which is all dependent on the high priest being in this particular state as well.
Yeah.
It required a lot of sacrifice. It required time. It required garments. It was a whole process, and so they would have to do that all over again, basically, if Aaron had gotten leprosy or had become unclean in this way. That doesn't solve the problem necessarily, but that kind of makes sense of it, and it clearly scares Aaron.
Yeah.
I mean, he's like he pleads
Yes.
with Moses, saying, "Hey, we don't need to go down this road, right?" So I think it is actually meant to be a threat to him as well, because
Mm-hmm.
that's how he receives it, as a threat to himself.
Yeah.
So yes, she bears the 7 days of leprosy, but it was aimed at both of them, and that's exactly how Aaron interpreted it.
It does make sense, like you're saying, like logistical, that would have been a nightmare to have to restart over.
I
And
mean, that's a good reason. I don't think it's a reason enough. Like if they had to
right.
start all over
But I'm
again,
saying it's a logical reason when you're reading it to think,
yeah,
if you were in their shoes, perhaps that would be maybe what your mind went to.
yes.
Mike, any thoughts that you want to expound on this one? Because I know this is kind of a layered question.
As well, so to address the first part about the numbers 5, I agree with Drew that this is
Hmm.
definitely, this is about protecting the woman. And interestingly enough, yesterday my pastor was doing he bravely took on the whole entire story of Judah and Tamar.
Oh,
Okay.
And it was interesting was that later on in my small group we were talking about it. We grabbed onto the fact is like Judah's oldest sons, they did stuff that apparently only Yahweh, the Lord, would actually know about, right? Especially the second son, because he was not doing his duty as as prescribed by the whole entire like culture,
right.
and really only he and Tamar would know that he was doing this kind of thing of avoiding his duty, and yet it is the Lord who judges him as well. So in some
Mhm.
sense, that
Oh yeah, that's
Numbers
good.
5 is pointing out to that. It's like, okay, you may have a suspicion, or maybe you're jealous, but then we're down to a case of he said, she said kind of moment. Who can
Mhm.
actually come to a final, real, just decision? Well, it's the God who can see all things.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
to me, that the Numbers 5 is really actually a mercy, because it's Yahweh who's coming in defense in many ways of the woman. It's the decision of the punishment is no longer in the hands of the priest or the husband or anyone else in the community. It's really giving it up to Yahweh. You are the one who sees all things. You know whether I'm innocent or not.
Mhm.
I'm
And
gonna steal
so
that from you, Mike.
go
I'll give you
ahead.
credit. I'm gonna steal that. That's a great connection point.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's just it's such a, it is really a merciful thing, because like you pointed out, Drew, the trial by water or dipping her hand in boiling oil or
Yeah.
water, like that's just terrible. Like of course what you think is going to happen. You're like, let's see if you will drown. 9 out of 10 times you probably will, right? Versus this is just essentially water mixed with some dirt, with maybe a little bit of bread. maybe at worst you'll get some indigestion. Maybe at worst you'll have
Yeah.
maybe some burping, but it's nothing to the degree that your body would be so physically harmed in of itself of the material that you're ingesting. So in many ways, it's only God who's going to know this woman is guilty, or most likely she's probably innocent.
Yeah, well,
And,
and
and
it's
so
it's it's like both of you guys said, it's like a mechanism for protecting the vulnerable, which
yeah,
is what a lot of these laws were about. If you view it from that standpoint, it really does turn a negative into a protection positive.
Yeah.
yeah,
It's a bad
and
situation to begin with, though.
Sure.
If that
yeah,
suspicion has creeped into somebody's mind, it's
Yeah.
very difficult, even if you're that person, to put that out of your mind. Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah. And with Miriam and the whole entire reasoning, I agree with Drew as well. I think it is going to be super complicated. Aaron, like, what do you do with that? Though it is interesting that Aaron pleads to Moses as though Moses is the interceding priest
Right.
for him, right? Of
Which was the
like
question.
yeah,
Like, is
which
Moses
was the
special?
whole entire issue.
Yeah.
Though
Yeah.
one weird thing that I did notice is that in the first verb that describes Miriam and Aaron, the one Miriam's name is first,
Mm.
and the verb in the NIV it says Miriam and Aaron began. That verb, the var, when they spoke, it's in the feminine singular.
Hmm. Oh,
So
interesting.
yet Miriam and Aaron. So it's both of
Hmm.
them, but instead of using the plural masculine, which generally would be used as like a generic for both people, it's
Yeah.
using the feminine singular version of the verb. So
Hmm.
I wonder if that may
Maybe
indicate that
foreshadowing.
maybe
Yeah.
it was Miriam was the main instigator and Aaron was
Yeah.
sort of following along with his older sister in some sense.
And the complaint, it's such a funny passage because it begins with they complained about his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite woman.
Right.
And you're like, well, that's bad sentence structure. And then they're like, is he the only I mean, it's like a total non sequitur, change of topic. Like they're complaining about his Cushite wife, and they're like, and is he the only prophet? Doesn't God speak to us? So it's very difficult to figure out what exactly is motivating them to act this way outside of the normal. We can all kind of put ourselves in their shoes and
Yeah.
say, hey, aren't we special? Which is going to be the same problem with Korah. Is, hey,
Hmm.
are everybody special, right? The whole everybody's special, so nobody's special argument, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, let's jump to one more question, and then we'll hit a little commercial break, and then we'll come back for a few more. So this next question says, in chapter 6, we see Moses speak the iconic blessing over Aaron that many churches use to this day. Can you unpack its significance and why it is so widely used in churches today as a common blessing?
I mean, as far as its meaning, certainly you get this language of putting on, and it's a particular verb. I don't want to get nerdy, but there is a particular verb here that's being used that tends to be used with blessings, oaths, to put something on the mark of Cain. God
Hmm.
put the mark of Cain on him to protect him mercifully, right? And so in the same prayer, we get this kind of the idea of God's mercy being put on us in some way, or a blessing that shows mercy to us. It is interesting that this is in the front of the book. I mean, if this blessing were at the back of the book, it would actually have a different meaning. Like the placement matters here, because it's at the front of the book where everything hasn't gone downhill yet.
Right.
There's still this kind of like, and we're gonna have trumpets and everything is gonna be great, and we counted everybody's heads, and we're gonna go up in the and then, hey, Aaron, you should just like put this blessing on the people. And I do think we should be very careful. A blessing is typically physical. Like, I'm not even sure these people had an idea of spiritual in the way a lot of people think of spiritual today. But they're thinking like, we're going to have children. Our crops are going to grow. We're going to be able to survive. I always say today, if you sneeze and somebody blesses you, you should tell them to give you a biblical blessing, like a $5 bill or something, something physical that actually helps in some way. Or if they hand you a tissue and say, bless you, that's kind of closer to what we're talking about.
Sure.
But you could easily read this with the kind of mindset that, the Hebrews were all about works and doing things in order to gain merit with God, which is not true at all. They were about responding to God's grace through obedience and listening to His voice and following His guidance. But I think we want to be careful to say it seems to presume it, and the whole logic of the whole Torah and the logic of all the prophets presumes the blessing that you're asking the priest to put upon you is that you are you're doing your part, right? It's not like, let me be the crappiest husband in the world, but give me the most awesome marriage I've ever experienced. That would be a very weird prayer, right? Like, I don't really want to hold up my end, but I want everything to be golden and good. So it seems to presume that you're looking out to the nations to bless them, that you're looking internally and keeping justice and righteousness in your own community, that you're making sure not to exploit the vulnerable, that you're putting up all the protections that are in the Torah for the vulnerable. And that's how the blessing comes about. It's just interesting that it's this, particularly the role of the priest, to put that on the people. It could also be referring to that kind of, it's the job of the Levites to keep a copy of the Torah that the king will hand copy in Deuteronomy 17. And they're in charge of instructing the people according to the Torah. So it makes sense that they would be the ones that are kind of putting the blessing on. And we're also, it's simultaneously an oath for the Levites as well. And we're responsible for making sure everybody, they're the sheriffs of the Torah. They adjudicate justice. They maintain the cities of refuge. They maintain the instruction of God. They maintain the house of God.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts?
I think besides, I love the reminder back to how the Levites were essentially in charge of so much of these aspects of the law and of justice. I think one thing though, and maybe for us as modern, worshipers these days, we do need to be careful of how sometimes we use this prayer, right? Because, not going into great detail, but my wife and I, we went through a very long period of like particular issues regarding with her health and questions about family and whatever else. And there was a popular song that came up years ago, especially when the pandemic was starting to start underway. And there was a line in the song, while it was using this prayer as part of its chorus, there was a bridge where it would mention, may his favor be upon you, and 1,000 generations, and your family and your children and their children and their children. And in particular for me and my wife, it was a difficult thing to hear because we were going through a liminal space where we were realizing we may never actually have our own physical children. And yet that the song itself and the way that the Aaron prayer is even implemented is almost as though this is normative, this is what should be, and what ought to be, and what everyone should strive for or should want. And so I think there is a little bit of a danger sometimes when we use this out of the context or forgetting that this is coming in a time right now in the book of Numbers that everything's going well. And like even the fact that it comes after the whole Nazirite description of like, how do people become Nazirite?
Yeah.
Like that to me is significant. It's about devotion
Yeah.
to Yahweh their God. It's about their allegiance and loyalty. And that this is the context that, all right, like we're giving an opportunity for people who are not born inside the tribe of Levi to even dedicate themselves so wholly to Yahweh in such a deep way. And then the Aaron prayer comes out. I think when my wife and I were able to move away from sort of like the confusion from like modern songs like that and realize that this prayer is capstoning a very beautiful moment of like, yes, you don't have to be part of the Levi family to serve Yahweh, to dedicate your whole body, everything about you to Yahweh himself. You could become a Nazirite, both male and female. Both of you, both types can actually serve the Lord in such a deep way. And I find that the fact that this prayer comes after all that, like there's something about that is very encouraging and not hurtful, but actually encouraging in the end.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually had that same thought when I was reading through Numbers of it talks about that and then it goes straight into, chapter 6, yeah, when the blessing happens. And it does make you wonder if there is a connection there. But I would love to hear y'all's thoughts on something that you said, Mike, like if people can accidentally use this in an incorrect manner, what would you both say is the proper way to use this in today's culture and situations and scenarios that we all encounter?
I'll let Mike go first.
Well, I think at least for me and my wife, like where our church, that they have known about our journey for the last couple of years, and I think it's both and right. Like my wife and I, we had to come to processing and sort of reflect upon ourselves, like what was it about like that song, or what was it about this prayer that was bugging us for a while.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a sensitivity on the community's part, the understanding, okay, where are people at? And are we implying something that should not be implied as being normative or what everyone should have to always strive for? I think there's a pastoral sensitivity that has to come into play for that.
Hmm.
I think the prayer itself is beautiful. I think when it's framed in the context of a two-way street, a community and also a relationship that is not just one way, but we are wanting to love and serve the Creator God Himself,
Mm-hmm.
and out of His goodness and His kindness, oh yes, we desire the blessing that He would give to us. But at the same time, this is all in relationship. It is not a transactional thing. It is a relationship thing.
Yeah, I think I always say everything in the Bible has to be translated. Even in the Old Testament, later readings of the Torah had to be translated and reinterpreted for people who spoke Hebrew and lived in Jerusalem in the Iron Age. They still didn't understand. They didn't get it all, right? The word slave doesn't mean the same thing. The word poor doesn't mean the same thing.
Right.
The word blessing doesn't mean the same thing. And so I think we just need to be careful about what this blessing means in its own context. It is asking for the blessing of health and livelihood for people who are agrarian subsistence farmers who lived on the edge and didn't, unless God brought the rains and made their
Mm-hmm.
crops grow, some people might have been malnourished or even starved. Children might have starved over the winter, right? And
Right.
so they kind of had a desperate need to trust God, and this blessing kind of turns that around on them. Especially in the ancient Near Eastern world of God-human relations, it's almost like, without projecting too much, like the fatherly gaze
Mm-hmm.
of a God upon His people.
Yeah.
That gods didn't talk to humans in the ancient Near East. They certainly didn't reveal things to them. They didn't instruct them and guide them lovingly. They didn't say, I love you and you must love me because look at how I've treated you, right? This is all new territory in the ancient Near East as far as God-human relations. And then to have say like, hey, God actually is looking upon you with favor. Like the Latin theological term for this is Deus pro nobis,
Mm-hmm.
God for us. Like
Yeah.
He's for you. He's not one of these hidden gods that you don't know why they're mad at you and they're just smiting you and blighting your crops and killing your children. And that also, the flip side is it has responsibilities. So I think of it kind of it gets used in benedictions a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I always, when I do the benediction or I receive the benediction, I always feel it in my body like a weight being placed upon it. It's like commissioning police officers or firefighters.
Mm-hmm.
You're not
Mhm.
saying like, "Hey, you're good. Everything's great about you. Congrats for all your training." It's saying, "Congrats, you did a lot of things to get here. Now get to work, right? Like
Yeah.
now go out." And I think you have to have both sides of that. I just presume that both sides of that are functioning. We're for you. The support network is here. We're not dumping you out on the streets on your own, but there's work to be done. And
Yeah.
so I think it should have, as Mike said, that kind of horizontal and vertical
Yeah, I like
side that
that.
so often cite.
Yeah, that's awesome. I like that description because it should be done in relationship and in community. And with that factor at play, it makes it feel weightier then. And I think that that's important for sure, and not just used, like Mike said, just flippantly or incorrectly, and adding additional language to it that might not necessarily have been what it was intended to be,
And I
you
think
know.
not. Oh, sorry. Not to come after worship leaders.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
definitely
there
not
is
our
a
intention. We love worship
yeah.
leaders.
Yeah. No, what I mean, when you read through the Bible, when I became a Christian, when I was about around 20, read through the Bible, and you read through it enough times, you realize why people quote the same passages. Like
Mhm.
there are kind of high points where they grab a lot and pull it together, you know.
Hmm.
And and so I think there is a tendency in modern worship music to kind of head towards the highlight reels in scripture.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some, but that always means the highlights are going to be in, you know, even in sports. I hate sports analogies, but it's the highlight is in the context of the whole game. The highlight reels
Right.
of all these speeches that have been made recently by presidential candidates. It has the whole. You got to listen to the whole speech, right, in order for it to make sense properly. And so I think there. That's the only time where, and I now know the song that Mike is talking about. It clicked in my head that I actually have heard the song, and I had the same thing, like, oh, it's kind of sad how they turn this into God wants to give you lots of stuff and everything's good, and it feels very individualistic to me when it's actually a call to action for a community,
Mhm.
as you just said
Yeah.
as well. So
Yeah.
so just being careful.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Context is everything, right?
Hmm.
All right. Well, let's jump to a quick commercial break, and then we will come back with two more questions in this episode. If you're not already reading with us, we'd love to have you start reading today. Every month in the Awakening Bible community, we read a book or several books of the Bible together. Readings are only 1 to 3 chapters a day, 5 days a week, with weekends reserved for catch up or deeper study. And as you read, we know that you will likely encounter questions, but that's where we come in. Submit your questions at AWKNG.com, and we will do our best to get them answered for you right here on the Ask a Scholar podcast. Well, welcome back, everyone. Let's jump right into our last two questions so that we can get as much time as we can hearing from you, Dr. Johnson, and from you, Mike. So this is the question. In chapter 11, we see Moses appointing elders to help lead the people. How is the concept of divinely appointed leadership seen in stories like this, sometimes misused in communities of faith today? What should these stories and examples actually teach us about authority and responsibility in a faith community?
Okay, well, that's a simple question that has a very quick answer. Good. I mean, it's a great question
Yeah,
on that passage as well, because I don't think I would have ever turned it to responsibilities today. I think there's a long thread of teaching throughout Scripture that this has been a cardinal point. I mean, obviously, Exodus 18 is in the background of this, of Jethro saying, "Hey, this what you're doing is
yes,
not good. You know, you
yep,
need to appoint." And he listened to the wisdom of his father, who was kind of a Yahweh worshiper, kind of not, you know. But he could see that this is not right.
right.
Um, Deuteronomy 17, where you have the appointing of judges formally, like Deborah,
Mm-hmm.
who's going to be appointed to actually adjudicate the Torah and settle disputes according to the Torah. Um, and here, you know, again, the context is, you know, for me, this feels very much like 1 Corinthians 1. You know, not many of you are noble, not many of you are wise according to the philosophies of the world, right? Like, you're kind of chump change, but even God can use that. If you look at the context of this passage, there's a little light roasting and shaming going on here.
Yeah,
Like, these are the guys who are not necessarily your rah rah shish kebab. We get it. We're on board. We're it guys who understand everything. But there's a little bit of humiliation that you guys rebelled and you kind of rejected what's going on. But God's going to use these people anyways. I think the other thing that's interesting is he doesn't say, go get, you know, Jedediah, Jose, you know, what
mm-hmm.
go to the list and go get these guys and bring them in. It seems to be that there is a working list of people who are known in the community who are brought in. Then it's left to the discretion of Moses or some other crew that we don't know off site. which to me comes back to a lot of teaching across Scripture, including Jesus's own teaching on, these people are known to be wise, and Paul's teaching, obviously, on raising up elders. Um, I don't. I would be a little worried. I do. I think about biblical leadership, the biblical marks of leadership all the time, and even the
Mm-hmm.
kings. Like the king is a great one. He's like, oh, you want days to come? We're going to give you a king, right? A leader, someone who's going to like take care of stuff. Um, and so, what does a king do? Well, he can't like make politically arranged marriages. He can't build an army. He can't build a treasury so he can pay off, Assyria or Egypt for protection. Um, and he's got to handwrite the Torah all the days of his life and read it. Or sorry, read it all the days of his life. And it basically strips down to a king to a non-king status. So the king doesn't have subjects who he rules over. He's one from
Mm-hmm.
among his brothers. He shall not raise his heart above his brothers. It's in almost every respect, it describes not a king, right? It
Mm-hmm.
describes just some schmo who
Yeah.
God has used to rule Israel as God is the king. I liken it to like it's like saying uh, take a police officer and send them out on their beat, but take their badge and their gun, their baton, their handcuffs, their
Mm-hmm.
taser, their notepad, take all that stuff away from them and be like, okay, now go out on the mean streets of whatever city,
Right.
and be a cop. And you're like, well, I don't actually know how to be a police officer without the tools of the job. So it's a very like that's like this very strong view that power, David's rehearsal of Hannah's prayer. It's not by might. The
Mm-hmm.
bows of the mighty are broken, as Hannah says, and David says it's not by sword, spear, or javelin. Same thing in Joshua 24. It's not by your bow or by your sword that all these things happen. It was by God's power, the hornet He sent. So there's this real like uh, we may think of even eldership at the local level. I was a pastor for 8 years and served in lots of churches, and we think of that as a hierarchical role where these are the
Yeah,
people. There's a lot of American religion, like Americanism, coming in, right?
for sure.
This is the hierarchy. These are the executives who perform the executive functions of the community, and we are under them, and they make the decisions, and we kind of follow. Or maybe we're in a church where we get to vote every once in a while, but and really, what you see not just starting here, but including this passage, is that elders come in as kind of what we would call today public servants of the worst kind. Like it's a tough job. There's no glory. You don't have a lot of power. And the goal is to do like what Paul says in First Corinthians, to unite and reconcile
Mm-hmm.
normal day-to-day problems that are going to emerge amongst people who are even trying, much less the people who aren't even trying really to follow the Torah. Um, so I think that, you know, I I'll say two things. One is I have to remind my students and myself that the average church in America today is like 82 people.
Mm-hmm.
They're small, they're local, and they do the work of the gospel,
Yeah.
right? That's what normal people. So I have to remind myself that what I see on YouTube is
Yes,
not normal. It's the
exactly.
far end of the extreme. If you got
Mm-hmm.
300 people in your church and you're doing great things in your community, that's great. You're just out of the norm. You're
Right.
not the normal church. Um, and then secondly, I did a master of divinity, and I went and worked at a church, and there was kind of a latent view that I had a desk, I had an office, there's like I was a junior vice president. At any other company I would be called a junior vice president, right, or something like that. I was in charge of Christian education and children's ministry and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I do worry that what you see described as this role of elder, and that it's important for God to work through people amongst his people and amongst the
Mm-hmm.
nation that he's trying to bless, that those are both values. But this is not like a Pauline Jesus New Testament radical ethic that we just hear with Jesus, where you know where power is actually weakness. That's not new. It starts way back here, and I think you get a first strong whiff of it here
Mm-hmm.
in Numbers.
Yeah. Mike, anything you want to add to that one?
I mean, I appreciate what Drew mentioned about
Yeah.
especially sort of the reversal of power. For me, I grew up in a Chinese heritage church context, and I did not realize that in other Asian Christian churches that it was not the same way within the Chinese heritage church. Because the typical thing of when you go into the ministry in a Chinese heritage church, another name that's often kind of jokingly said about the pastor is that the pastor is also the janitor.
Mm.
That more often than not, and the history of the heritage church that I grew up in, the original founding pastor was, yes, he was the pastor, he was also the teacher, he was also the van driver, he picked up the kids, he would also do youth ministry, like he did everything,
Mm-hmm.
including cleaning the toilets,
Yeah.
doing all the rudimentary stuff. It's it's a hard it's a hard calling, and I think that's sometimes a refreshing thing to always be reminded of, that leadership is not necessarily a position of prestige, but it is a position of responsibility and of, yes, honor, but honor in the sense that you are able to take care of people who may not even know how to take care of themselves.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
um, there is this interesting line that was in Numbers 11 that I just gravitated and grabbed onto, was when people were asking about the two people who were not at the gathering, and the Spirit came upon them
Right.
and they started prophesying, and Joshua was getting all upset about that, of how come they
Yes.
weren't there. And Moses' answer is, it's like, are you jealous for my sake?
Right.
I wish that all of Yahweh's people were prophets,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them. That Moses's desire ultimately is that it's not ideal for there to even be elders who have to take care of people who may not be able to take care of themselves, but that everyone would
Right.
have the Spirit of God upon them and be responsible and be able to take care of the things and be empowered by God. And when I read that line, I remembered Paul, in that he said, a lot of you folks are desiring for the
Mm-hmm.
speaking gifts,
Yeah.
but I wish that you would desire the gift of prophecy.
Yeah.
I was like, holy cow! Like, in some sense, Paul is just repeating a line,
Mm.
or really a thought, a heart desire of Moses as he
Hmm.
was teaching the people in Corinth. Of like, I wish that you would actually let the Spirit of
Wow.
God empower you, enable you to be
Yeah.
responsible.
Yeah, I never saw that connection, but now that you say it, that's totally true. I mean, Paul is it seems he is totally echoing what Moses felt in this moment. And I also find it interesting that even then, like you were saying, most churches, if we really look at the landscape, they are smaller. They're 82 people, whatever that was. It 82 that you said the number.
Yeah. I think that
Um,
was a good
but
number.
but yet, on social media and on YouTube, we see these mega churches, and they feel like they are the majority, even though they, in essence, aren't. But when you see that structure and you see one specific person on what you would consider to be more like a pedestal, and then you read verses, Mike, like you just talked about in chapter 11, where Moses, he's literally fighting against that. He's like, don't put me up there. I want all of you guys to do this. He's immediately fighting against that perception that unfortunately we see a lot today, that can become detrimental if things happen.
And in light of what's getting ready to happen in 12, where the beef is going to be, aren't we prophets too? And then God,
Right.
even as my Jewish friend said, God has to correct Moses a little bit, like, no, you actually are a unique prophet, right? So, um, yeah.
That one's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting when you think of it like that, because I mean, Moses, he was called by God. He was divinely appointed. So I think there does have to be perspective when you're called to a position, to pastor, or to, in Moses's case, act as a prophet. There is a divine appointment on you that can't be disregarded. But then
Mhm.
at the same time, it can't be just handed out lightly
Yeah.
and done so flippantly. You know what I mean? It's almost like you have to see it in both ways, in my opinion. At least that's what I pull out of these scriptures.
Yeah. The most painful people to work with or to mentor in ministry are the ones who are way too excited to get up and preach.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're like, you're trying to pull them back and be like, this is a really complicated thing you're getting ready to do. You could
Yeah.
really mess up some people by things you say and do up there.
Yeah.
But then also people who are just like, oh, I'm not worthy. I'm,
Right.
I'm just, everything I think is trash. And yeah, and I was definitely towards the latter when I came into ministry, and somebody had that talk with me, like, hey, what were you were not confirmed by the elders and other people who saw this gift in you and thought you should do this.
Right.
Like, you got to do it and take the weight of the task,
Yeah.
and let it guide you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think it's really healthy to look at both sides. Mike, are you about to say something? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
I've been recounting in recent late with some friends of just like my own journey of going into a master's of divinity. And one of the reasons I went into it was really because I had to come to a sober realization of like, well, what are my talents? What seems to be the giftings from the Spirit? And this realization that if these things are true, then the best thing that I can do is to actually be properly trained. Because if I don't, and I'm just depending on raw talent, I could be very harmful to people. That was like a realization I had. And
Yeah.
so I went into it really because I just wanted to just learn. I had
Mm-hmm.
no clue if I would ever go into even being like a part-time pastor. I just wanted to make sure I had the proper training. If
Mm-hmm.
this like inclination, if this suspicion is true about a gifting or a talent that I might have, I wanted to make sure I was actually properly trained. Um, and it just all this is just reminding me as well of like a bit from Richard Middleton when he talked about the responsibility and the role of the prophets, that they were people who were literally liminal. They stood in the gap for the people. They interceded for the people on their behalf before Yahweh. But they were also charged with being, in some sense, the attorneys, the convictor, the prosecutor of God's people. Of you aren't keeping the covenant, you aren't obeying God. So they were in this in between state that is never easy because they have to represent both sides at the same time, and they can never feel at ease in one direction or the other. It there was always this interplay, and so when one wants to be a prophet, I don't think most people realize what that really entails, the responsibility, the weight of that.
yeah, it feels very much like Aaron and Miriam here, to go back to their story,
Yeah.
feels very much like the sons of Zebedee, coming up to Jesus and saying, hey, can we be at your right and your left hand side, when you
Right.
ascend? And he's like, you don't even know the cup I'm getting ready to drink. And they're like, no, 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 we got it. We're good. We're good. Right. So yes, lots of
Mm.
similar vibes here, to
Yeah.
use an already dated Gen Z term.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, let's jump into our last question for this episode. This is a fun one, in my opinion. It says, what theological meanings do the symbolic actions and objects throughout Numbers carry? So things like the bronze serpent, the budding of Aaron's rod, water from the rock, all these different moments, objects, actions. What kind of meaning do we need to look at here?
Uh, I when I hear questions like this, my first instinct is to say, well, let's put the brakes on symbolics. Again, because of my work on ritual, I don't think anything is symbolic in Scripture at all, or at least not in the way that most people think of it, as like, oh, that blood stands for life.
Okay.
This stands for that.
Yeah.
The system does not work that way. There's symbolism obviously built into the system of thinking, of biblical thinking. Um, but looking for one to one, like a parable is one for one. A man built a tower and he didn't count the cost. Like, you're
Yeah.
supposed to understand, the man is me, tower is following Jesus, the cost is I might have to give things.
Hmm.
That is one for one. The rituals and the kind of symbolism that we see here, it doesn't quite work that simply. Um, so if you look at something like Aaron's staff budding, uh, symbolic movement in Scripture is usually what Mary Douglas calls is condensed symbology. Like, it's doing a lot. It's pulling together a lot of things. Um, you think of communion. Communion is related to Passover. It has a cannibalistic element to it. Um, it's you have to start asking all kinds of questions. Well, if it's a new Passover, then who's the angel of death? Because that's what the Passover is about, is the angel of death, and
Yeah.
who protects people from the angel of death that is surely coming. And So what? Oh, it's Jesus. So there's all these things going on in this. It's all condensed down. So when I hear something like Aaron's staff budding, I just start literally. Why are they telling us this story? Of all the stories they could have
Mm-hmm.
told, like John says, I could have told lots of stories, but I told these. So
Right.
why this story? Well, the story at a flat level, it functions just to to repeat a theme that we see throughout Numbers, which is there are special people called to lead us in the special job that we're going to do, and you need to listen to them and do what they say. I mean,
Right.
it's that. By the way, Gospels have the exact same. Jesus has the exact same problem in the Gospels. When God comes down on the Mount of Transfiguration, 3 years into public ministry with these disciples, and God says one sentence. What does he say to Peter, James, and John? This is my beloved son. Listen to him. Back in the heavens. Like, that's a moment of embarrassment. Like, they should have
Right.
been like, oh, yeah, I guess we should have been listening to
Yeah.
him. 3 years in, maybe we should have done that, right? So there's that strong, like, you get a lot of these paying it forward impulses, these frustrations. When I see Aaron's staff, something like that, the serpents, the craziest thing about the serpent story is not fiery serpents. It's not a bronze staff. It's not that people will later worship that bronze staff, as we find
Yeah.
out in Second Kings. Craziest thing is some people didn't even look at it when it could have saved their life,
Right.
right? Like the number of people that died after the serpent was raised so that they
Mm-hmm.
could see it and be saved. That's just insane. Um, but all those people who crossed through the Red Sea and ate manna, and then had a massive orgy to a golden calf, is also insane.
Right.
And Jesus' disciples, who the Gospels describe as being hard-hearted when they see Jesus doing certain miracles, his 12, the disciples are described as being hard-hearted, like Pharaoh
Mm-hmm.
for Israel, and in Mark's Gospel, they don't ever seem to understand anything Jesus is saying or doing. If you take the short ending of Mark's Gospel, it's very negative. We should have been prepared for this, right? That people could walk along, see all the miracles that were meant for them to trust, and trust particularly that God is working through particular people to get to everybody, to get to all the nations.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a new message that begins in Genesis 1:12. I mean, there's all these touch points where you just get this message reinstated time and time again, and yet you get these people who stubbornly disbelieve. They look at it. There's not a single miracle in the Bible where people say that didn't happen, right? So it's not a bunch of miracles where people are like, I used to have back pain, but it's all healed now. It's a miracle. No, it's all public,
Right.
open, available.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody sees it, and they're like, well, that's not natural. Like,
Yeah.
it's something. Um, but people will disagree on by what power it happened, and so a lot of what you're seeing in Numbers is the unbelievable drumbeat. It really is unbelievable from the outside. Looking over the shoulder of the narrator, looking down, you're like, how can these people be so stupid? And
Right.
then you just need a good friend to read Numbers with you and go, well, remember that one time where God did that thing and then you forgot about it a week later. And then like
Gosh,
3
it's
weeks
so
later,
true.
you did that thing and then you did that. Or like, so to me, this is why some ancient Near Eastern scholars who aren't even Christian, they just read ancient Near Eastern literature. They talk about the Hebrew Bible and they say it's got a skeptical mood to it. It's very sober about humans and how they behave. It's not romantic. It's not creating fantasies of humanity. It's like, no, humans are pretty messed up. And even when they have lots of reasons to trust, they sometimes don't when they should. And
Mm-hmm.
okay, so I'll get off my diatribe there, but I think there's a lot of thematic elements that prepare us for the hardships of the Gospels, where Jesus does all this work lovingly as a prophet. I mean, he clearly wants to be described as a prophet. He wants
Mm-hmm.
to be seen as the prophet of Israel. He wants to be seen as the It's not Saul and David on the Mount of Transfiguration. It's Moses and Elijah. He wants to be seen as the
Mm-hmm.
prophet. God is quoting Deuteronomy 18. I will send future prophets and I'll put my words in their mouth. And that even then, people aren't going to listen to them. Even then, people are going to stubbornly refuse
Yeah.
to heed what God is trying to do. And it kind of prepares us today, I think, in the church. This became a real point for me as a pastor. I put in a college try with everybody, but when people stubbornly refuse, like I'll pray and sometimes I'll just go like, you know what? It's not their time yet, or they're
Right.
just not, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
We try. I mean, God tried. God, do we know how hard God tried with Israel, and still they stubbornly refused to listen to him in some cases? So we should try hard and realize that that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You notice I totally deflected on the symbology thing.
Well, no, but you did answer it in the fact that we shouldn't necessarily see it like that. We should see it as acts that God did to get the attention of the people and try to capture their hearts so that they wouldn't continue to go astray. And it was public and it was visible. Like you said, I like that analogy versus somebody said, I had back pain and now it's gone, but nobody can see that. So
Right.
are they lying? Did they really have back pain? Is it just a fluke? Whatever. But these were public and they were visual, and you couldn't deny that it didn't happen. So I've never honestly thought of it that way. I mean, yes, I have, but at the same time, you have, like you said, so many people that are trying to say, oh, well, this connects to this, and this means this, and this symbolizes this. And so sometimes I often will find myself that I'll be reading something and I will be trying to figure out, okay, does this relate, to something in the New Testament or a foreshadowing of whatever is to come. But in reality, it could have just been that God was like, hey, I'm here. I love you. This is what I'm doing for you. I want you to turn your hearts and stay with me. It could have just been that symbol.
Yeah. And it can be both. I mean, certainly, I think some people would say like the Nehushtan, which is the serpent staff.
Mm-hmm.
John 6-8 has a lot of wordplay on being raised up, airo, from the Greek and Septuagint. And it seems like some of that wordplay, the way he describes what Jesus says and does, it feels very much like I will be raised up on that day. I will be the point of salvation from the kind of the plague that's coming, and it's as easy as trusting in me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the appeal of Jesus. It's the appeal of all the apostles in the epistles. Is like you really, it really is just about trusting God, like with your whole body, not some mental belief. And so I think this is playing a part in that drumbeat of you have lots of good reasons to trust God, so now you need to do that thing,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I think we can all relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, any final thoughts as we wrap up this episode?
I mean, I think it's worth kind of remembering as well that in the context of numbers, just like you said at the beginning of this episode, Drew, that the way like we start off with the census and then like 40 years and then you get to the end of 40 years and it just shows like there is a skeptical nature, as you said earlier, and it's like this is 40 years of essentially wandering in this wilderness in many ways that they did not have to be in.
Yeah.
um and so the burden and sort of the weight, it's just slowly wears down on people, right? Where challenges to leadership are happening, where even eventually the two leaders that are constantly just being over and over again repeated as you should listen to them, but they themselves even have their moment of
Mm.
failure.
Yeah.
And it's sort of almost like it's teaching us a lesson in many ways, but through the negative example of like, don't end up being like this. Don't
Mm-hmm.
like see the warning signs before it gets to a point where you do lash out in anger publicly before God,
Right.
and that's not good. And it's almost like this, like a tale of warning of
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
the consequences of an irreparable decision, and you don't know what that will mean in the long term. And,
Yeah.
and we see something like that play out in the book of Numbers.
Yeah.
And it might be just because I have 4 adult children, like all in their 20s, or I have one 18-year-old, but um, it's just like this negative teaching by negative example. A lot of people don't like that. They're like, they think, I don't know, they want something more romantic and hopeful or whatever. And when you really get people in the biblical literature, they realize how negative and how much warning is in there. But, like even something like driving a car, when do people start checking, like actually checking their spot rather than just looking at their mirrors? It's usually after they almost hit somebody, right?
Totally.
And it's like every teenager's like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to check my blind spot, but they just do a quick glance at their mirrors and then they go over, and
Mm-hmm.
then hear that honk and they hear a car braking and swerving, and they're like, oh, I almost killed that person.
Right.
Um, and that's just the like that's the assumption of all the biblical texts, that we are all not going to check our blind spot. So let us paint the most vivid picture of you of
Mm-hmm.
how horrible this goes. And when you get into Deuteronomy, I don't know who you're having on for Deuteronomy, But you get to Deuteronomy 28, they take their time and slow it down, and they get graphic and horrific. And it's actually, the genre is horror, of how horrible it's going to go if you just stubbornly refuse to be instructed by God. Okay, I'll shut up now.
Well, thank you for being with us today. This was great discussions and great answers to these questions that the students have sent in. Let me ask you, is there any resources that you would like to share with the listeners today?
I love the stuff we do, the Biblical Mind,
Yep.
the Bible Project, obviously, Mike's work through you guys. There's so many good. We're drowning in a sea of great biblical resources. So
It's
go to the
true.
better ones and stray from the worst ones.
Yes, amen to that. All right, well, let's ask one final fun question because we like to get to know our guest a little bit. So, what is the favorite thing that you like to do on a day off? When you have a day off, what do you like to do?
Lots of walking. I play guitar or drums just for fun, nothing professional, or
Okay.
and hang out with my wife. Always. Kids, we're at that point in life where sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. But my wife is always down to hang. So
Awesome. That's great. Well, thank you so much for being a part, and we're excited to have you back for the second episode that we're going to tackle on the Book of Numbers. And so those that are listening, thank you for listening. Make sure you like and share and subscribe and leave us a review. All those things help us, and we will be back soon with more answers on your questions on the Book of Numbers. If you're enjoying the Ask a Scholar podcast, click follow on your podcast listening app to subscribe. Want to help further our mission? Consider becoming a monthly partner at AWKNG.com and help us make an impact in the lives of others all around the world as we work to make biblical understanding accessible to all with no exceptions. Join us next time as we get more of your Bible questions answered. And don't forget to visit AWKNG.com to engage in all our biblical resources that we offer.